Please take a few minutes and review this prompting slide. We want to welcome you today to Excess Cost Report Federal Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, Part B, brought to you by the Office of Special Education Finance and Budget in the Department of Special Populations at the Virginia Department of Education. The Office of Special Education and Budget, often referred to as the FAB team, is responsible for ensuring the IDEA funds are assisting, monitoring, and managing the federal IDEA allocation and reimbursement requests by public school divisions, and to ensure that all this funding is supporting students with disabilities. And as you can see, we have some new faces without their pictures. We're real fortunate to have some new staff with us as we go forward. Today's session I want you to review this information so that you will have this on hand as you're going through your application. It'll make it much easier to have your resources in front of you as you fill out the forms. This session will cover 6 sections. The first one is on excess cost overview. The session is intended to support school division personnel in understanding LEA excess costs, the regulations, the practices, and data submission that includes reviewing the 4 components and differences between MOE and excess cost, the importance of maintaining accurate records for monitoring and audit purposes, calculation differences and methods for determining elementary and secondary cost, a review of the worksheet that you will be completing, steps for submitting the data. There will also be some helpful resources and upcoming Q&A session information. There's an extra section called Section 6, which has calculations for you to review if need be as you're going through the steps of completing your workbook. We have with us today Shalonda Lewis, who many of you know. She is the contact and expert person for excess costs, and she is the person that's in charge of excess costs and for you to contact with any problems. Remember, we always like to solve problems before anything is submitted so that we can get approval the first time. Shalonda is very open to having discussion with folks as they're going through the process of completing their workbook so that they can hand it in correctly. So in section 1, we will talk about excess costs. There'll be an overview, which is what is required, and actually what is excess cost, the 4 calculation components, and that MOE is not excess cost. So with that, let me introduce and turn our session over to Shalonda. Shalonda, welcome.
Thank you, Joanne. Again, everyone, I would like to welcome you to this session of excess cost. So let's dive right on in. Why is it required? Okay, excess cost means that those costs that are in excess of the average annual per student expenditure in an LEA during the preceding school year for an elementary school or secondary school student, as may be appropriate, and that must be computed after deducting specified amounts. Now, 300.202 of the federal regulation also states the excess cost requirement prevents an LEA from using funds provided under Part B to pay for all of the costs directly attributable to the education of a child with a disability. Let's dig a little further into that and see what it really means. The federal regulation simply states that the average per pupil amount that is spent on students without disabilities is the same amount that must be spent on students with disabilities. In addition, the regulations also require that IDA Part B funds cannot be spent until the basic cost of students with disabilities has been covered. IDA regulation requires each LEA to compute the average expenditures per elementary or secondary school using kindergarten through grade 7 is considered elementary. Grade 8 through grade 12 is considered secondary. Next slide. There are 4 components that are used for determining excess costs as far as the calculation is concerned. We calculate for the total expenditures. We will then subtract out certain expenditures, then compute for the average annual per pupil amount, and finally, we will determine the minimum amount of funds to spend for students with disabilities. MOE and excess costs are frequently confused, and there are a lot of questions about it. Please note there are more differences between the two than similarities. The greatest similarity is that they're both a federal requirement. In regard to maintenance of effort, it can be found as part of the excess cost calculation. The only difference here is that when you bring in the MOE maintenance of effort amount, it has to be broken apart between elementary and secondary grade levels.
Okay, that was a pretty good explanation of those federal requirements and the differences between MOE and excess cost. I know for many of you who may be doing this for the first time, it may just sound like jibber jabber, but please read these over and read over the regulations, and Shalonda will be more than happy to answer any questions. We're going to proceed to section 2, which is on excess costs, the application screens, the data collection process, and distinct and separate cost. Shalonda?
Thanks, Joanne. In regard to preparing to input your information for excess cost, you need to first make sure you're able to access SSWS and to see the excess cost application. If you're not able to do so, then you will need to contact the person who is considered your SSWS administrator within your division or LEA. Once you've contacted that individual, they should be able to provide you access to the application, which will then allow you to move past the initial screen that's on the screen now. Okay, so now that you have access and you're able to go into the application, this is the first screen you will see, and it will give you a date in which the application will close. And in this case, it says it's going to be May 10th, 2024. And that really is the date for this submission process. And then we give you some directions on the right and left that can also be found in your guidance document. But again, please make sure you have access to this, because the next step will be clicking on the worksheet that's on the right-hand side, and you will begin to enter information. So the collection of data, as we talked about before, needs to be separated into 2 categories: elementary and secondary. The calculation for excess cost, a screen print of it is in front of you now, and you can see where it says total expenditures, total capital outlay, debt services, IDA Part B allocation. Those are some of the things that you will need. But please understand everything that's in front of you has to be separated by elementary and secondary. Again, K through 7 and 8 through 12. Please remember, for this data collection, you do not need to input information for preschool, nor do you need to add information for adult ed. Those are excluded from excess costs. Now we're going to start talking about things that make it a little bit more complicated. We're going to start looking into what do you do in situations where maybe the expense is not directly related to excess cost, to elementary, or directly related to secondary. It kind of crosses over into both of them. How do you figure out where do you put that cost? This is probably a good time, if you don't already have a good relationship working with your finance department. You need to make sure that they understand what needs to be done, and you guys should collaborate. But let's dig further into this and see what's next.
Thank you, Shalonda. So I understand from what you shared is that the excess cost is all about what local and state expenditure is, and dividing that into elementary and secondary. And elementary is K through 7, and secondary is 8 through 12th grades, so that we know how much that cost is per pupil, and then determining how much more we need for excess costs to support our students with disabilities. So our next section will be on what are those expenditures that you're able to count at the local and state level of dollars, and completing the worksheet, I'm sorry.
Thanks,
Yolanda?
Joanne. Thank you. Distinct and separate costs is what I was started to talk about before we ended the last section. So we're going to just talk briefly about it again and make sure you all have the resources you need to be able to move forward with it. So in most cases, you should be able to figure out if the cost is related to elementary and secondary. But there are times and expenses that truly are not just for one. It may cross over both. In those cases, it is recommended that those costs be allocated based upon work assignment and not just on student enrollment. So in the instances, you're like, well, Shalonda, when would this happen? So, let's look at some examples here. We talk about pupil transportation. An example of how you can apply the cost is based upon student routes, not this, because you're going to have students maybe that cross between middle and high school, or elementary and high school. So you may need to figure out that cost and how to break it apart, and it may be easier to do it based upon routes. Also, another option could be central office fiscal staff. Apply the cost based upon personnel count assignments within the district. It may be another option that you have versus just using student count, because the central office staff, they actually service everyone and not just one specific group, elementary or secondary. They actually work with both. Let's look at an example screen in front of you so that you can see exactly what I'm referencing. Okay, so right here in front of us, we have where you can clearly see elementary and secondary. You can see marching band, those things like marching band and technical education, those are going to be found in your secondary. They're not going to be found in elementary at all. But the PALS reading program that we're all familiar with, it may be found in elementary. Well, will be found in elementary, shall I say. But as you can see, as I've outlined on the previous slide, these are the areas on which they cross. Custodial staff, central office information, those things, those people cross. So you would need to actually break those apart so you can allocate those costs correctly. Please know that at the back of this presentation in section 6, you will be able to find additional examples that you can use to figure out how to allocate those costs. And at any time, reach back out to the staff at the BDOE or myself. Okay, so now we're about to start the process of putting the data in the system. And so let's talk about, we're going to walk through the lines of the calculation and talk about what needs to be in those lines. So line 1, we're going to start entering what is considered the total amount of expenditures. And they come from all sources, local, state, and federal. So you don't exclude anything other than pre-K and adult ed. In most cases, these amounts will match those that you put in your annual school report. The exception would be probably maybe a reporting error or the 9K through 12 expenditures. Okay, let's move to line 2. Okay, so line 2, this is where you're going to enter your capital outlay and your debt services expenditures at this time. And again, have to be broken out by elementary and secondary. I'm definitely going to keep saying that so that everyone goes into the worksheet with this information already split apart. It'll make your work so much easier. Understanding again that capital expenditures are capital assets such as buildings, equipment, land, or expenditures. And don't forget the capital improvements as well that can be included in this particular section. And debt, that must be also included. These expenditures are considered non-operational. So in the calculation, they're actually going to be excluded, or shall I say backed out, as we prepare to calculate the average cost per student. Now, once you have line 1 and line 2 completed, line 3 is auto-calculated. And it will give you the total expenditures minus the capital outlay and debt services. Let's move to line 4. Okay, line 4A is where you would input your IDA Part B allocation. And line 4B is where you would input your ESSA Title I Part A allocation. And 4C is where you would input ESSA Title III Part A and B allocations for schools. These should be entered elementary and secondary. Line 4D. This is where the total state and local funds are entered in in the cells for line 4D. And this information should match your IDA MOE. Please note that this should be broken out for secondary and elementary. On line 4D, it will give you the amount that your IDA MOE should equal. Please make sure that when you add the elementary and secondary together, that it does equal back to that number. Line 4E, if your division uses local or state funds to support programs under the ESSA Title I Part A and or Title III Part A and program, then this amount will be entered here, again, broken out by elementary and secondary. Okay, line 5. This line will be auto-calculated at this point, and it will show the total of the other deductions reported under lines 4A to 4E. Line C is also auto-calculated, giving you total expenditures less capital outlay and debt services and the other deductions. And finally, line 7, this line is populated with what is the spring SRC collection, child count information. This number cannot be changed, so don't try to change it. If you find something wrong with it, you will need to reach out to me and let me know. So we're really moving down the calculation, and we're getting closer to the amount that we need. Line 8, this also is auto-calculated and shows now we have the show. This will give us our average annual per student expenditure. Please note that this is the minimum amount that the LEA must spend for the education of each of its elementary and secondary students with disability. And as I stated before, funds under Part B of the Act may be used only for costs over and above this minimum. Line 9, this is also pre-populated from the December 1 child count information that was submitted by your school division or LEA. When we have an example, when submitting for the 22-23 school year, December 1st, 2022, child count data will populate. And that is the situation for this data collection. It should be your December 1st, 2022 child count information. Again, if you find this to be incorrect or something wrong, please reach out and let me know. And now, line 10. This line represents the total minimum amount of funds that you must spend for the education of children with disability. In this amount is going to be multiplied line by line 8 and 9. So once all the data has been entered and verified for accuracy, you are done and can submit to the DOE. But if you find that you are not ready to submit, you have the option on the screen to save. So you now have your amount, you've all submitted it. If you need to make a revision or make a change, you're going to have to, if it hasn't been approved by your superintendent, the superintendent will be able to push it back to you. Otherwise, you're going to have to reach out to myself at the VDOE to reopen the collection window. So you, at this point, have now completed entering all the information in the excess cost worksheet. And it needs to move now to the superintendent. Let's see what happens next.
Well, thank you very much, Shalonda. And what I understood from that is that this worksheet really gives me step-by-step process and instructions about what to do. And it would be very helpful to watch this recording when I have the worksheet in front of me and the guidance document to put it all together. Just watching the video is nice, but being able to put all the pieces together to get accurate information so that you can complete it accurately is very important. Thank you very much, Shalonda. So as we go forward, we're going to go section 4, the data submission and verification. And this is the references that Shalonda was making about making sure your superintendent follows certain steps and looking at what our process is at FAB as we review your submission, and also looking at the timeline. So Shalonda, if you're ready, we'll move on to our 4th section.
Thanks, Joanne. So now we're ready to move the submitted document over to the superintendent. I believe in the last screen, I referenced that if you were finished with submitting all the data, you would hit submit. If you're not ready to submit it to the VDOE or to the superintendent, then you would go ahead and just hit save. That will allow you to make changes and come back to the document. Let's go to the next screen. So once your superintendent receives it, first of all, let's make sure that he or she signs onto the SSWS system, where they will find SDCA, which is a superintendent application for approvals. Once they log in, will find the verification report. The verification report will allow them to either approve or disapprove. Once they have hopefully approved it, the submission will be done, the window will close, and it will move to the VDOE. If for some reason you had submitted it and perhaps you need them to return it back to you, this is at the point they can do so by hitting disapprove. It will push it back to the person who input the information or those who may have access to make any edits that they may need to make at that time. Please note that this is not complete until the superintendent approves it. I cannot stress that enough. It will not be considered closed or complete until the superintendent approves it. So what happens once it leaves the superintendent? It makes its way to the VDOE. Well, an analyst or specialist, that will be me right now. I'm going to review and analyze all the data submitted. I'm going to send an email asking questions about the data, if I have any. And then after I have received your responses and I feel that they have been, I've got the answers that I was looking for or what I feel comfortable that answers the information we need here at the VDOE, then we will be able to close this out and you will be done. Now, if you have any questions that you like, if you have any changes or edits that need to be made, I will have to reopen the collection window. And at that time, the superintendent will need to approve it again. But hopefully you'll get the email back that all is well and we will close this out and move on. Joanne, I think that might be it. What do we have next?
We just have one more.
Okay. I can take it.
Okay.
So the submission window opens May 18th and it closes May 10th. That's the same date as the annual plans are due. So make sure that you submit both on that date. Also, the newsletter that will release the information about the opening will be distributed on March 14th of 2024. Okay. So make sure at that time you're able to hit the link and pick up the excess cost guidance document. And also it'll probably have information about the upcoming recorded video, which you're probably watching now if you're hearing me talk about it. Now, we also have a question and answer session that will be held on April 10th at 11 a.m. That is definitely a great event to attend. If you have any questions and concerns and have not already finished your excess cost calculation and submitted it, please join us on April 10th at 11 a.m. to hear more or what may be asked amongst your other peers in the state. Again, this information is forthcoming in Assistant Superintendent's email of special populations if you have any questions.
Okay.
That's
Thank you very much, Shalonda. And that kind of, you told us about how the superintendent needs to submit it, that there can be, he can deny it or she can deny it and send it back to the originator of that submission of the data, to say, this doesn't seem right. And so there can be some back and forth at the division level by approving and disapproving at that level. Once it's all approved and you feel that it's happy, then the superintendent hits approval and submits it to DOE, where Shalonda will review it and email to you any questions or concerns about the data. And again, there'll be a lot of back and forth discussion, if need be, about your submission until it is correct. And it is due the same day as the annual plan, as Shalonda said. And so it's always important, if you can get it done quicker or earlier, it's always advisable to get it submitted and that off your plate as soon as possible. So in section 5, here is just some helpful information and reminders for you to use as you go through this process. Remember to use the division's excess cost report from the prior year. And remember to download the excess cost report guidelines and procedures manual. It is referenced on our website as the excess cost calculations guidelines on the FAB webpage. Again, I can't iterate enough how important it is to have the PowerPoint, this video recording, and your manual for calculating and submitting the information, and your last year's report in front of you when you are working through this process. It will make it a lot easier for you. And it will be good to help you follow the same methods of calculation as you used in prior years. That documentation of the method that you use of calculations from year to year is important to keep for audit and monitoring purposes. So it's important not only that you get the information incorrect, but you are calculating the information year to year as in the same way. It's also very important that with whatever you do, that you are following federal and state laws and standards in purchasing or procurement or travel or any of that. And that all, when you have this information at all, you need to have all the backdrop information and evidence that says that we are following these laws and standards of procurement. Also, you need to make sure from the uniform guidance that all the individuals that are receiving payment being paid in their salaries under the federal grant, under IDA, that you have time and effort reports for each one of those individuals. And that means they have to verify that they have used the time that you have paid them with federal grant money specifically for special education services. So be sure that that is in your files and you keep that on a regular basis. That's a big lookout for when individuals come to monitor and audit your school division. And the bullet number 3, I can't emphasize again, it's very similar to the others. Make sure that you've got all your financial and programmatic records that's required by state and the federal laws in whatever you're doing, whatever purchases that you are making that you're going to use to substantiate this excess cost data submission. Number 4, the property purchased with Part B funds can only be used for special education. If you're going to use any of special education dollars, IDA funds, and it's not all for special educations, then that's a big no-no unless you can substantially and emphatically prorate it to take the IDA funds out that are only going to be used for the purchase of that part of that product for special education students. And oftentimes that's just really challenging for school divisions. And the last thing is any materials that is not usable or anything that you have bought with special education funds, you must maintain an inventory of the property and in fact maintain maintain having those those purchases in your building. Let's say for the summer, you purchase computers for some students and they're going home and not going to need those students. You have to make sure that you have collected those students or any other products that you have bought for your students. So once more, I think we've had Shalonda's picture and her email address up here a couple of times and her phone number. We cannot stress enough how important this is that you get this information right the first time to get it in. It just bogs down the system when we start having to deny the submissions. So please, please call us ahead of time, call Shalonda. She's more than willing to work with you through any sort of process that's causing you heartache. Again, the collection window opens March 18th. It will close the same day as the annual plan on May 10th. The Q&A session will be April 10th. It's Wednesday at 11 a.m. There will be an assistant superintendent's memo coming out with the link to the Zoom for you to join us for the Q&A session on that date. Please come with your questions. Everyone comes to hear what other questions the school divisions have. And sometimes there's a lot of silence, which is okay because people are processing the information. But also come with your questions so that we can really dive into it and not only be a learning experience for you, but a learning experience for everyone else and having that community process of learning. So we want to thank you before we go on to our extra session. As you can see from past PowerPoints or presentations, we do have some new staff here. Nanasha, I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She is starting here soon. We have Rosalind Taylor, who has joined us, and also Keisha Reed. So you'll be seeing their faces soon. I'm going to move on to the extra section, which are calculation examples. I'm not necessarily going to talk about each one of these examples because they are there for you to work through and to be able to use if you need to during the process of doing your excess cost calculations. So the first one is about determining cost for mixed grades. You know, you have reach over where you've got custodial people who work in elementary and a high school, front office staff that in the administration building that works for both. So being able to separate that by usually personnel hours and their base salary is the best way to go with that. Here's the teacher's cost based on number of students served in each level. You can see one teacher salary and how it's divided between the 6th through 9th grades that she or he interacts with and how it's calculated. It is absolutely forbidden to do like a 40-60 ratio kind of number because we need for these numbers to be more precise and exact for the excess cost submission. It can't just be a guesstimate, if you will. So you really need to dive in and do this extra work. It's part of the requirements from IDA funding and something that needs to happen and something that could get you in a twist when you're monitored or audited. So this is another level way of counting teachers' costs based classes taught at each level. And remember, these are methods of calculation. And when you're doing methods of calculations, you should try to do the same method every year. And if you have to change the method, then you need to document why. So what I'm also saying here is that you need to have a procedures manual that designates how you got the kind of numbers that you did, and that's on hand for any sort of monitoring or audit purposes, but also so that your numbers compare and are similar from year to year, and there are not any big deviations in your data. So here is a calculation based on the number of hours spent per level. So there are some options about how you calculate and the methodology that you may use to get to your numbers. But remember that you need to document what you use from year to year to have that methodology be similar. And that it takes time to dive into this and it's required. You cannot do an average or a 40-60 split or a 50-50 split, and that does not work at all. So these were our extra slides. We hope that they'll be helpful for you and that you will be able to take the time and stop them and work through them and figure out what is your best method of calculation that's going to give you the kind of dollars that you need for K through 7 and 8 through 12 excess costs. And with that, We'll close the recording, and please give us a call if you have any questions. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that we both hope, Shalonda and I, that this session has been helpful and will continue to be of help to you. Thank you very much.